It's such a hassle. I don't want any part of it. Belle says, her voice dripping with irritation, as if she finds my husband and me repulsive. It seems like a nuisance to her that her own family member is ill. We're moving to a new house soon, so we can't be bothered with caregiving. My son's voice reveals his true feelings, a disdainful smirk almost audible. He's looking for the first chance to end the call. Well, that's that, so good luck with the live-in care. I'm left speechless by their attitudes, and the call with my son ends. My husband and I are left alone in the hospital room. My husband, asleep in the hospital bed, has dementia. Repeated incontinence and forgetfulness, along with the frequent marital spats that followed, had pushed me to my limit. Unable to bear such a life, I had no choice but to hospitalize my husband. I'm sure he would have preferred to stay home. I decided to provide 24-hour care, though I knew deep down it might not be necessary, perhaps out of a sense of guilt. I contacted my son and his wife to inform them of this decision, only to be met with their harsh words. It hurt, but I bit my lip and couldn't talk back. The hospital's tests revealed the cause of my husband's dementia. He underwent surgery immediately to address it. The operation was a success, and it was supposed to cure his dementia. But even though the anesthesia should have worn off, he still won't wake up. Could it be that he will never wake up? Is it because I forced my reluctant husband into the hospital against his will? Then dawn breaks. My husband still hasn't awakened. I couldn't help but feel a tightness in my chest and started to cry. Suddenly, a warm hand grasps mine. Startled, I look up to see my husband smiling at me. He has woken up. There was so much I wanted to say, but I was overwhelmed and cried again. He gently strokes my hand. Mary, it's okay now. I was at a loss for words at the clear and strong sound of my husband's voice. My name is Mary. I'm 65 years old. I'm currently a homemaker. I graduated from high school at 18 and joined a company working for a while. As time went by and I got used to the job, I fell in love at first sight with my husband, who came to secure a business deal with a sales pitch. After that, he seemed to have succeeded in his sales efforts and began visiting the company frequently. One day, after finalizing a deal, he left his business card holder behind in his excitement, and I was told by my boss to return it to him, so I hurried after him. Outside the company, I called out to my husband, who was jubilantly raising his arms, and he was surprised. I couldn't help but laugh at how funny he looked. When I gave him the forgotten business card holder, he thanked me profusely. As I tried to return to the company, dismissing it as nothing, he called out to me and invited me to dinner. It seems he was also interested in me. Blushing, we made a dinner date and parted for the day. After several dates, we began a relationship. During our days off, we went out on dates and had a great time. On my 24th birthday, during one of our dates, he proposed to me. I accepted immediately, and we informed our families. Years later, we had a child and lived happily. Our son grew up, became independent, and married, finally easing the burden on our shoulders. Thinking we could finally relax, I noticed a change in my husband. He stopped going fishing, which he loved so much. He, who was always polishing his fishing rod and excitingly planning the next fishing trip, now didn't even touch the rod and often spaced out. "What's wrong? Are you worried about something?" I asked, but he just stared blankly without responding. At first, I thought it was just a reaction to his retirement, simply becoming apathetic. But my assumption was wrong. One day, I noticed something odd about his walk. His stride was shorter, and he shuffled his feet. He also staggered around corners and nearly fell several times. He had never shown such behavior, so what could it be? "Jim, shouldn't you see a doctor?" "It's nothing. Just haven't been sleeping well lately." Despite his response, I hadn't seen him stay up late. Then a decisive incident occurred. As I descended from the second floor, I smelled something odd. Wondering what it was, I headed to the living room and saw the corridor from my husband's room to the living room was wet. To my disbelief, he had had an accident. He acted as though nothing was wrong, sitting on the living room sofa. "Jim, could you stand up for a moment?" Upon urging him to stand up, it was as I feared, his pants were wet. Realizing this was no trivial matter, I tried to rush him to the hospital, but he stubbornly refused to go. After several attempts, I had to admit defeat. He was a man, and I was no match for him. Feeling like I was getting nowhere, I called our son. "Dad wet himself? So what? Ugh. You can't help but take him to the hospital. What a pain. Just call an ambulance." Dismissed with those words, I reluctantly called an ambulance. While waiting for it, I changed my husband and cleaned up the corridor. I wondered how things had come to this. When the ambulance arrived, my husband was taken to the hospital. He resisted with all his might until he was in the ambulance. He insisted he was fine and refused to get in. The paramedics finally managed to soothe him enough to take him away. Upon arrival, he was so agitated that they had to sedate him. And now he's lying in a hospital bed. He had some tests done immediately after being admitted, probably exhausted from it all. I'm waiting for the results, but in the meantime, he's been admitted, so I've been back and forth between home and the hospital to gather what he needs. With the admission process complete and nothing else to do, I sat holding his hand, just waiting. He stared blankly at the ceiling. Reflecting on recent times, he had often misplaced his wallet, lost his keys, or returned from shopping without any purchases. I had never seen him like this before. Could this be what they call dementia? Lately, he hadn't even been calling me by my name. Maybe he no longer recognizes who I am. These thoughts made me cry without realizing it. What if he never calls my name again? I was gripping his hand tightly, but he just kept staring blankly at the ceiling. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door of the hospital room. In a panic, I wiped away my tears and responded. A somber-faced doctor and nurse, presumably the ones in charge, entered. I swallowed hard, wondering what was happening. "We need to have an important conversation. Could you please call your family members?" At those words, everything went dark before my eyes. I managed to respond to the doctors as I left the room, saying to call them when my family arrived. After finally being able to move, I called my son. "What now? Call the family? Is Dad in bad shape?" "Just come now." "No way. It's a hassle. Call me when it's really the end. See ya." My son hung up abruptly, and I collapsed to the ground helpless. Worried about my absence, a nurse came to check on me. I managed to tell her no one was coming, and she immediately went to fetch the doctor. The doctor explained the situation. There might be something wrong with my husband's brain. They would start thorough testing tomorrow, and they'd work on identifying the cause and aiding his recovery. I was told various other things, but I was still in shock from the day's events and listened absent-mindedly. Noticing my state, the doctor said they would prepare another bed for me to rest, and then left the room. Shortly after, the nurses brought in the bed, told me to ask for anything I needed, and went back to work. Sitting on the provided bed, I looked at my husband. He was still staring blankly at the ceiling. After watching him for a while, I made up my mind about something. I will provide 24-hour care. Despite not wanting to contact him, the possibility of a brain abnormality meant I had to inform my son. I told him about the likely long-term hospitalization and my decision to provide round-the-clock care, to which he responded, "Good for you, Mom. Getting rid of the hassle. That's funny. 24-hour care?" I couldn't stand his vulgar laughter and hung up the phone. For several weeks, I spent most of my time at the hospital. Finally, the day for my husband's surgery was set. It seemed there was indeed something wrong with his brain, and it would be a major operation. Just the thought of brain surgery was terrifying. During the explanation of the procedure, My husband seemed to understand, but he soon forgot all about it. I don't understand success rates for surgeries, but I believe he will get better. As the surgery approached next week, my son called unexpectedly. I answered the phone with reluctance, and his cheerful voice came through. "Dad's doing good? Silly question, right? Ha! Oh well, we're moving into a new house the week after next." A new house? I was puzzled by my son's sudden move, and where he got the money. But he blithely went on about his plans. "Once we move, bring us a housewarming gift, and make sure Dad stays alive till then, with your 24-hour care, will ya?" His callous words almost made me smash the phone. On the day of the surgery, my husband was, as usual, staring blankly at the ceiling. Sometimes he would come back to reality and converse, but soon he'd be lost in thought again. I clung to the hope that surgery might fix everything. When it was time for him to go to the OR, I stayed close to him, holding his hand and giving encouragement. Even if he seemed distant, I couldn't stop talking to him. A nurse told me this was as far as I could go, and I had to stop. I couldn't take my eyes off my husband. It may have been my imagination, but I thought our eyes met for a moment. The nurse told me to wait in his room. Reluctantly, I returned to the room. I don't know how many hours passed. When I realized it was dark outside and the room was pitch black, startled, I turned on the light, and a nurse called me. Trembling, I listened as she explained that the surgery seemed to have been a success. I nearly collapsed with relief when my husband was brought back. He was still asleep with an oxygen mask, but he was breathing. I held his hand with a feeling of relief. His hand was cold, but I could feel warmth in it. Now, it seems, all we have to do is wait for him to wake up. The nurse said to let her know when he wakes, and I nodded emphatically. The thought of my husband returning to his former self after a successful surgery filled me with joy, and I found myself crying again, holding his hand. I decided not to sleep until he woke up. But dawn came and went, and even past noon, he didn't wake up. Nurses and doctors came to check on him, but he showed no sign of awakening. While he didn't wake, I kept thinking about everything that had happened since he started acting strangely. Maybe it was my fault. Because I called him dirty, got angry when he forgot promises and didn't seem to care, or was exasperated when he threw a tantrum about not wanting to go to the hospital. Recalling various things made me fear that he might never wake up. As these thoughts overwhelmed me, my chest tightened and I cried. Lately, it seems I do nothing but cry. Suddenly, I felt something warm touch my cheek. Surprised, I look up to see my husband smiling at me. Frozen in confusion, my husband spoke to me gently.
"Mary, it's okay now."
Hearing my name after so long, I forgot I was in a hospital and burst into loud tears. A nurse came at the noise and calmed me down, and then I was the one left in a daze. Soon after, the doctor came to check on my husband. He seemed to be okay, but he would have to stay in the hospital a while longer to be observed after the brain surgery. My husband's responses were coherent. I could finally feel at ease. After the doctor and nurse left the room, my husband made a scary face I had never seen before. When I saw it, I instinctively shrank back, thinking he was angry about the past treatment.
"Mary, I'm sorry. I remember everything that guy did. Until the surgery, it wasn't clear. But now that my head is clear, I realize it all happened to you. I'm truly sorry."
I didn't understand what my husband was talking about. Apparently, he remembered all the exchanges that had taken place in front of him with our son. Then, he asked me to tell him everything that our son had said and done that he wasn't aware of. Reluctant to snitch, but pressed by my husband's earnest gaze, I braced myself and told him everything. Upon hearing it all, my husband's face turned red, and he clenched his fists. When I told him to rest because he had just had surgery, he calmed his anger and sighed.
Where did we go wrong in raising them? It's okay to crush them, right, Mary?
Confused, I tilted my head, and my husband asked me something with a troubled smile. Hearing his words, I hurried home. Since then, my husband was discharged and returned to our home for the first time in a while. The house was a bit neglected since he hadn't been home much during his hospitalization, but he said it was no problem. I didn't bother much with cleaning up post-discharge. Instead, I called my son. Without mentioning the discharge, I told him I needed to talk about the 24-hour care and asked him to come over.
See, I knew you couldn't handle it. All right, I'll hear you out.
Hours later, my son and his wife showed up, smugly sitting on the living room sofa. Belle joined in with a sneer, looking down on me. Pretending not to notice, I quietly served coffee.
So what's the consultation about?
Firstly, congratulations on the move to your new home.
Thanks, you'll give us a housewarming gift later, right?
I think you've received enough already.
Huh?
Caught off guard by my unexpected response, my son and his wife exchanged puzzled glances. We haven't received anything from you yet. Belle retorted with a sneer, to which I looked her straight in the eye. You took something from our savings, didn't you? The blood drained from my son and his wife's faces. They turned away from me and started whispering to each other.
Where's the proof of that?
My son tried to argue back, pulling at his mouth, but I continued matter-of-factly. It's been withdrawn. A thief could have done it. A thief wouldn't bother returning the bank card, right? And they wouldn't know the PIN either.
That's...
As they stammered, I delivered the final blow. And the place where the bank card was kept? It was different, too. That's a lie. I put it right back where it was. Silence followed. My son was dumbfounded. Belle, who had stood up in the heat of the moment, was now standing frozen, sweating. I said nothing. Silence ensued for a while. Belle slumped back onto the sofa, hanging her head.
Did you set us up?
If there was nothing guilty, you wouldn't have been caught.
Isn't that disrespectful to us?
My son began to shout suddenly. He seemed desperate to escape the situation with his outburst, but I would not let that happen. I would never forgive them for withdrawing money my husband had painstakingly saved up and using it for buying a new house and moving expenses and then trying to run away.
Apologize for insulting Belle.
I couldn't understand what my son was talking about. It was his spouse and him who should be apologizing. I glared at my son in silence.
So what? I'm not scared of your glares.
Shouldn't you be the ones apologizing instead of me?
To whom, Dad? What's wrong with me using it effectively if he's not going to use it anymore?
As my son shouted, the living room door opened. My son and his wife lost their words at the sight of my husband entering. My husband sat beside me with a stern face. My son and his wife were speechless. When my husband slammed the banking card on the table, they were shocked.
Tom, you moved to a new house. Congratulations. How did you manage the moving funds? Your favorite, gambling?
Our son remained silent. His bravado had vanished.
Do you think I knew nothing while I was suffering from dementia? Didn't you think about how Mary cried uncontrollably every time she spoke to you? But even if you had surgery, dementia can't be cured, so you'll forget about today soon, right?
My son was flustered by my husband's accusation and shouted back in a loud voice, but his argument made no sense. That's right, dementia can't be cured. All that's left is to deceive you, Mary. Unfortunately, that plan won't work. Jim's dementia is curable. The surgery was successful. Jim won't forget anything anymore. Everyone froze at my raised voice. After a moment of silence, my husband spoke quietly.
Tom, what you've done is a crime. Even if you are my son, you can't just break into our house and take the banking card. And withdrawing little by little so you wouldn't be found out. What were you thinking? It's because you were careless and left without locking the door.
Yes. When I heard that my husband was hospitalized for brain surgery, I was worried and went home several times for laundry and baths, and it seems I had forgotten to lock the door during one of those times. When my husband regained consciousness after the successful surgery, and I told him everything, he also thought it was strange that our son had moved to a new house. It made sense. Our son and his wife were big gamblers. They never worked properly, but somehow they always had money for gambling. Apparently, they had been begging for money from my husband from time to time, but he had firmly refused. Maybe they thought this was their chance when I forgot to lock the door.
But I didn't take the banking card or withdraw the money. It was all Belle. I recently wondered why she had so much money.
Stop lying. You told me to get the banking card, and you withdrew the money. I don't even know the PIN. My son had no choice but to shut his mouth. It's a crime to withdraw money without permission, even if it's from a family member. And they had not only covered moving expenses, but also seemed to have furnished their house with new furniture and appliances. Even so, my husband's savings were not entirely gone, so they probably happily gambled away the remainder. You can never be too careful. The PIN was stuck to the back of the banking card with a post-it by my husband. It wasn't a direct sequence of numbers. It simply read wedding anniversary. There's no way Belle could have known the date.
Read this thoroughly, and if you agree, sign here. And if Belle throws a fit, I won't hesitate to turn you both over to the police immediately.
With that, my husband thrust a sheet of paper in front of my son and his wife. It stipulated they must return all the withdrawn money, never gamble again. My son must work at a construction company owned by my husband's friend, and Belle must find employment and work properly. My son took the paper and pen from my husband with a look of dissatisfaction and silently signed. Belle seemed like she wanted to say something, but signed reluctantly under my husband's stern gaze. My son and his wife left dejectedly. I heard they divorced not long after that. It seems their blame shifting caused a rift in their relationship. But, even wanting to live separately, they were at a stalemate due to their drained moving funds, effectively living a domestic separation. My son is now working hard at his temporary job, sweating to repay the debts he created, including those from consumer finance. On the other hand, Belle, who thought she would live happily ever after moving into a new home, apparently complained to her friends about her misfortune. But the rumor spread quickly, and now she can't show her face in public, working multiple jobs at clubs to pay off her debts. As for us, it turns out my husband had more than one banking card, and we're using that to pay for surgery and hospital bills, and to get by until the son and his wife repay everything. My husband says,
I was saving for a trip with you, but we can go later. Let's just enjoy our time now.
I never thought, fearing my husband might never wake up, that we could spend such happy times together. I can't thank him enough. Here's to many more years together.